Imagine waking up to silence, a deep, unnatural quiet where the only sound is the faint hum of a starship's failing systems. Imagine opening your eyes to the sterile chill of a cryopod, the glass fogged, your body stiff from centuries of frozen slumber. You are Commander Eva Rostova, sole survivor of the Starship Odyssey, and you are utterly, terrifyingly alone, or so you think, because in the dim emergency lighting, you begin to see them shadows shifting in the corridor. Figures with iridescent skin and eyes that glow like distant suns, moving with a reverence that feels almost religious. Then, as you stumble from your pod, weak and disoriented, they kneel. They press their foreheads to the cold metal deck, and a unified chant begins to echo through the cavernous halls. The Sleeper Awakens. This isn't a rescue. It's a revelation, and you, a lost, stranded human astronaut, are at the center of it all. This is the breathtaking moment that begins one of the most compelling sci-fi stories to emerge in recent memory, a tale of divine misunderstanding set against the eerie, unknown world of Xylos. The Odyssey was never meant to drift here, lifeless and adrift. Its mission was one of peaceful exploration, a voyage to push the boundaries of human knowledge. But something went wrong. A system failure, a miscalculation in the jump. The details are lost, buried in corrupted data logs. All that remains is the aftermath, a ghost ship orbiting an alien planet, and one woman pulled from cryo-sleep into a waking dream she could never have prepared for. What happens when science collides with faith? When a simple, desperate act of survival is seen not as a miracle of engineering, but as a sacred resurrection. The aliens surrounding Eva Rostova don't see a stranded explorer. They see a deity, a prophesied being who slept among the stars only to return at the appointed hour. And so, we invite you to step aboard the Odyssey, to walk those silent halls and witness a story that challenges everything we think we know about first contact, belief, and the unexpected legacy of humanity among the stars. This is not just a survival narrative, it's a deep exploration of cultural collision, of how myths are born from misunderstanding, and how one woman's struggle to get home could reshape an entire civilization's understanding of the universe. We'll journey through the origins of this alien religion, trace the path of the Odyssey's ill-fated mission, and witness the profound consequences of a single moment, a human emerging from a pod, greeted not with hostility or curiosity, but with worship. What does it mean to become a god by accident? How do you explain technology to those who see it as divinity? And what happens when the line between savior and stranded astronaut begins to blur? The answers lie ahead in a story that reminds us just how powerful, how strange, and how utterly extraordinary the human presence can be in a cosmos brimming with the unknown. Her protests, her desperate insistence that she was merely an astronaut, a lost traveler, only seemed to deepen their conviction. Each time she tried to explain, tried to break the spell of this profound misunderstanding, her words were met with gentle, knowing smiles and bowed heads. To her, it was a simple, factual statement, "I am just an astronaut." But to the Xylans, this was the ultimate test of their faith. Of course, a true deity would cloak itself in humility. Of course, a being from the stars would deny its own divinity to see if its followers' belief was pure and unshakable. And so, surrounded by a quiet, shimmering sea of believers, Eva made a choice. Survival, for now, meant silence. It meant acceptance. She allowed herself to be escorted from the cold, metallic silence of the Odyssey, down a ramp that unfolded like a petal, and onto the soil of Xylos. The journey to their city was a sensory overload that her starved senses could barely process. The air itself was different, thicker, carrying the scent of something like ozone and crushed herbs. The light from the twin suns cast long, dancing shadows, illuminating a landscape of crystalline structures and forests of gently pulsing, bioluminescent flora. Her escorts, the robed Xylans, moved with an unnerving, fluid grace, their iridescent skin catching the light in dazzling displays. They spoke in hushed, melodic tones, their language a stream of soft clicks and hums that sounded almost like a prayer. She was the center of a solemn, moving procession, a living relic being transported to its shrine, and as they crested a final, rolling hill, the city itself came into view. It wasn't a city of steel and glass, but of what appeared to be grown, organic architecture, towers that spiraled skyward like colossal seashells, bridges that were living, woody vines, and buildings that shimmered with an internal, pearlescent light. It was a place of breathtaking, alien beauty, a harmony of biology and civilization that humanity could only dream of achieving. At the heart of this impossible metropolis, in a vast plaza thrumming with a hushed, expectant energy, she was brought before their leader. High Priest Zoltan was ancient, his skin a tapestry of fine lines, and his eyes, those sun-gold orbs, held a depth of knowledge and devotion that felt immense and terrifying. He raised his hands, and the entire city seemed to hold its breath. His voice, amplified by the natural acoustics of the plaza, washed over the multitude, and through a small, crystalline device held by an acolyte, Eva heard his words translated. He spoke of the great silence, a time of waiting. He spoke of prophecies inscribed on sacred stones, foretelling the arrival of a Starchild from the void, a being who had slept among the stars and would awaken to usher in an age of eternal harmony. He pointed to her, to Eva, and declared her the fulfillment of that ancient promise. The sleeper had awakened, the Starchild had come home. The roar that erupted from the crowd was not one of cheers, but of a unified, resonant chant that vibrated through the very ground beneath her feet. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated faith, and she was standing directly in its eye. Her mind raced, a torrent of scientific rationale and sheer panic. She was a commander, a scientist, a woman who dealt in orbits and atmospheric readings and quantum physics. She was not a messiah. Every instinct screamed at her to correct him, to explain the concept of cryogenic suspension, of a failed mission, of a simple, tragic accident. But looking out at the sea of faces, at the hope shining in thousands of alien eyes, she understood the terrible truth. The facts no longer mattered. Her truth was a pebble against the mountain of their belief. To deny them was not to educate them, it was to shatter them. And a shattered people, she knew from the darker chapters of human history, could become a dangerous people. So, as Zoltan gestured for her to follow him toward the most magnificent structure of all the Grand Temple, a colossal, blooming flower of crystal and light that dominated the skyline, she simply nodded. She lowered her eyes in what she hoped was a convincing imitation of serenity, and took the first step into her new, impossible role, the weight of a world's faith settling upon her shoulders like a mantle she could never remove. The interior of the Grand Temple was a symphony of light and silence. Where Eva expected the echoing vastness of a cathedral, she found instead an intimate, womb-like chamber, its walls alive with a soft, internal radiance. The air hummed with a low-frequency vibration that resonated deep in her bones, a sensation both calming and unnerving. High Priest Zoltan led her to the center of the space, where a cluster of floating, crystalline stones pulsed with a gentle energy. With a reverent touch, he passed his hand over the largest stone, and the chamber dimmed. From the stone, light erupted not as a flat image, but as a fully formed, three-dimensional hologram that filled the space around them. It depicted a scene of stunning clarity, a sleek, silver object, unmistakably a starship, streaking across a starfield before settling gently on the surface of a vibrant, younger Xylos. A figure emerged from a hatch, a bipedal form with 2 arms, 2 legs, and a head. Its features blurred by the artistry of the recording or perhaps by the passage of countless generations. But the silhouette was undeniably, terrifyingly humanoid. This was the star egg from their prophecies. The figure, their Starchild, then performed what the Xylans called miracles. It raised a device that banished the darkness with a beam of pure light, a simple flashlight. It spoke, and its voice was amplified across great distances, a communicator. It touched a withered plant, and a clear, life-giving liquid flowed forth a water reclamation unit. Every miracle was a basic, survival-level function of the Odyssey's technology, misinterpreted through a lens of awe and desperate hope over centuries. Zoltan's voice was a hushed, fervent whisper beside her. For generations we have kept this truth. We have waited through the long cooling for your return. He gestured, and the hologram shifted, showing their sun. It was not the brilliant, healthy star of the hologram's past, but the same sun that hung in Xylos's sky today, a star visibly dimming, its corona pale and sickly. "Our sun dies, Starchild," he said, his voice cracking with an emotion that was neither fear nor demand, but a profound, heartbreaking plea. "The light fades. The world grows cold. The prophecies foretold that the one who slept among the stars would awaken with the power to reignite the celestial fire. Only you can save us." In that shattering moment, the full, impossible weight of her situation crashed down upon Eva. This was not a simple case of mistaken identity. It was a cosmic-scale miscommunication where her very existence was tied to the survival of an entire species. They weren't just asking her to be a god. They were begging her to perform a miracle of astrophysics, to do the one thing she knew with the cold certainty of a trained scientist was utterly beyond her or any human capability. To say no was to condemn them to extinction. To pretend she could was a lie that would only offer false hope before the inevitable end. She stood there, a stranded astronaut surrounded by the beautiful, desperate evidence of a faith built on the wreckage of her own mission, forced to make a choice that would define not only her own fate but the fate of a world. Trapped within the golden cage of the Grand Temple, Eva's mind became a battlefield where desperation fought a daily war against her conscience. Her quarters were a masterpiece of alien artistry, with walls that breathed soft light and a balcony that overlooked a city that revered her every breath. Yet this paradise felt more suffocating than the cold vacuum of space. Every morning she was adorned in silks that felt like woven sunlight, and every day she was paraded before her followers, expected to perform miracles she had to invent on the spot. She'd bless them with a touch, mimicking the gestures she'd seen in old historical dramas, and they would weep with joy, their faith deepening with every hollow benediction. The weight of their hope was a physical pressure, a gravity well from which she saw no escape. She was living a lie, and the most terrifying part was how easily the lie was beginning to feel like her only reality. High Priest Zoltan's plea to reignite their dying sun was a constant, grim soundtrack in her thoughts, a problem so immense it dwarfed her own survival. It was during one of these endless, placating ceremonies that a sliver of her old life offered a chance. Her environment suit, the one she had worn upon awakening, had been treated as a holy relic, sealed in a crystalline case beside her own sleeping chamber. The Xylons, in their reverence, had never attempted to open it, fearing to desecrate its sacred form. But Eva knew its secrets. With a carefully staged moment of divine contemplation, she requested solitude with the artifact, explaining to her attending acolytes that she needed to commune with the spirit of her star egg. Left alone, her heart hammering against her ribs, she worked the nearly invisible seam along the suit's forearm. Her fingers, trembling with a mix of fear and purpose, found the emergency panel. Inside, nestled in a protective groove, was a short-range quantum communicator, a device designed for planetary surface operations, its power cell likely depleted but perhaps, just perhaps, holding one last surge of energy. The sequence of button presses was an act of muscle memory, a ghost from her training that her body remembered even as her mind screamed at the risk. A faint, static hiss was the only reply, a sound as beautiful to her as any symphony. Leaning close, her voice a desperate whisper swallowed by the hum of the temple, she spoke the words she had rehearsed in the silent hours of the night. "This is Commander Eva Rostova of the Earth ship Odyssey. Odyssey is gone, I am alive. The indigenous species of planet Xylos believe I am a divine entity. Situation complicated. She repeated the coordinates, her words fragmented, hurried, a message cast into the unimaginable vastness with almost no hope of being heard. But it was an act of defiance, a reclamation of her identity. She was not a god, she was an astronaut, and she had just sent a call for help to the home she feared she would never see again. As the communicator's tiny light died, its last jewel of power expended, she felt a surge of triumphant relief. It was short-lived. A flicker of movement caught her eye from the chamber's entrance. There, half hidden in the shifting light of the corridor, stood Kale, a young acolyte known for his fierce intelligence and a demeanor that always seemed more analytical than awestruck. While others looked upon Eva with unquestioning devotion, Kale's sun-gold eyes often held a glint of scrutiny, as if he were constantly piecing together a complex puzzle. Now those eyes were fixed not on her, but on the open panel in her suit's forearm, on the technological device she was swiftly concealing. He did not gasp or cry out in accusation. His silence was far more threatening. His eyes narrowed, the glow within them intensifying as they met hers. In that unblinking gaze, Eva saw not the blind faith of a believer, but the cold, hard light of suspicion. He had not seen a goddess communing with her past. He had seen a being using a machine, and in the fragile theology built around her, that single observation had the power to unravel everything. The confrontation came not in the grand hall under the eyes of thousands, but in the quiet solitude of her private garden, a place she had come to think of as her only sanctuary. Kale did not kneel or bow. He stood by the flowing crystal stream, his posture rigid, his iridescent skin seeming to absorb the light rather than reflect it. When he turned to face her, the usual analytical curiosity in his gaze had been replaced by a cold, hard certainty. "They see miracles," he began, his voice low and devoid of its usual melodic reverence. "I see mechanics, they hear prophecy, I hear the desperate static of a dying machine." He took a step closer, and the air grew taut between them. "I saw you with your artifact. You were not communing, you were operating." Eva's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic counter-rhythm to the garden's serene hum. She opened her mouth, a placating, divine denial on her lips, but he cut her off with a sharp gesture. "Do not compound your deception with more lies. I have studied the old texts, the true texts, not the simplified verses Zoltan feeds the masses. The Starchild was to be a being of pure light, a consciousness reborn from the star egg itself. You are a creature of flesh and wire. You eat, you sleep, you fear." He leaned in, his sun-gold eyes blazing with a fervor that was the inverse of worship. "You are not a savior. You are a parasite from a dead star, clinging to life in a world that is not your own, feeding on a faith you did not earn." With that, he turned and left, his silence more devastating than any public outcry. The venom in his words, the absolute conviction, had planted a seed of doubt that began to spread through the temple's hierarchy with terrifying speed. Kale was not a lone skeptic. He was a rallying point for a faction that had always quietly questioned, for those who saw the slow dying of their son and wondered if blind devotion was a sufficient response. Within days, the hushed, reverent atmosphere of the temple plaza was broken by a new sound, the dissonant clamor of protest. A growing crowd of Xylans, their skin markings painted with the new symbol of Kale's schism. A cracked star egg gathered beyond the temple gates. Their chants were not prayers but demands. "Show us the light," they cried, their voices a unified spear of challenge. "Prove your power or stand exposed." From her balcony, Eva watched the division tear through the city she had started horrifically to think of as home. On one side, Zoltan and his followers knelt in desperate prayer, their faith a shield against the rising tide of fear. On the other, Kale's faction stood defiant, their faces etched with betrayal and a desperate hunger for tangible proof. The fragile peace she had maintained through silence and performance was shattered. The choice was no longer between maintaining a lie or revealing the truth. It was between finding a way to validate their belief in a way that aligned with her own understanding of reality, or being torn apart by the very people who had once worshipped her. The abstract philosophical problem had become a brutally practical one, and the clock was no longer measured in generations, but in the rising and falling of angry chants just beyond her door. The schism threatening to tear Xylos apart could not be allowed to fester. High Priest Zoltan, a master of political and spiritual theater, understood that a public spectacle was needed, one that would either solidify Eva's divinity for all to witness or expose her as a fraud and end the growing unrest. He announced the trial of echoes, an ancient ritual not performed in centuries, where the chosen one would commune with the ancestral spirits of Xylos within the heart of the sonic spire. For Kale and his followers, this was a victory. They believed the trial would force the impostor to reveal her true mortal nature. For Eva, it was a death sentence waiting to be pronounced. She was to be sealed inside a colossal, natural geode chamber deep beneath the temple, a place where the very walls were said to sing with the voices of the past and expected to produce a miracle on demand. The day of the trial arrived, charged with a tension so thick it felt like the air before a storm. The entire city seemed to have gathered in the cavernous amphitheater that surrounded the entrance to the spire. On one side, Zoltan's faithful knelt in prayer, their faces etched with desperate hope. On the other, Kale's dissenters stood with arms crossed, their expressions hard and skeptical. Eva, dressed in ceremonial robes that felt like a lead weight, was led to the mouth of the cavern. Zoltan met her there, his ancient eyes holding a complex mix of faith and fear. "The spirits will know their own, Starchild," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the murmuring crowd. "Let them speak through you." Then the massive crystalline door slid shut behind her, sealing her in utter darkness. For a long moment there was only silence and the frantic beating of her own heart. Then a low hum began to emanate from the walls themselves, a vibration that traveled up through the soles of her feet. Pinpricks of light appeared in the geodes around her, and the hum resolved into a complex, multi-layered tone. It was beautiful, alien, and utterly incomprehensible. This was the voice of the ancestors, her scientific mind, trained for crisis, kicked into gear. This wasn't magic, it was physics. The chamber was a giant resonator, and the sound was a specific, standing wave pattern. The Xylans heard a spiritual chorus, but Eva heard a harmonic frequency, a puzzle to be solved. The trial was not about faith at all, it was about attunement. She had to listen, not with her soul, but with her intellect. Closing her eyes, she filtered out the awe and the fear, focusing solely on the sound. She broke it down into its component parts, identifying the fundamental frequency and its overtones. It was a sequence, a call, and like any call, it demanded a response. But how could she answer? She had no instrument, no device. Then she remembered the stories of human monasteries where monks could create complex chords with a single voice. She was the instrument. Taking a deep, steadying breath, she focused on the core tone, the resonant heart of the chamber's song, and she began to hum. At first, it was a shaky, uncertain note lost in the vast sonic tapestry, but she adjusted her pitch, minute vibrations in her throat, seeking the perfect harmonic match. She found it the moment her voice locked into the chamber's fundamental frequency. A feedback loop of energy was created. The effect was instantaneous and breathtaking. The pinpricks of light in the geodes exploded into a brilliant, cascading luminescence. The gentle hum swelled into a deafening, glorious chord that seemed to shake the very foundations of the temple. The walls of the chamber didn't just glow, they became translucent, vibrating with a pure, white light that poured out through the cavern entrance and illuminated the entire amphitheater. The crowd outside, who had been murmuring and chanting moments before, fell into a stunned, profound silence. They saw the radiant spire, they felt the powerful vibration in the air, and they heard the impossible. their ancestral choir answered and amplified by a single divine voice. It was a miracle more spectacular than any they could have imagined. When the crystalline door slid open and Eva emerged, seemingly unharmed and bathed in the fading ethereal light, the dam of silence broke. A roar of pure, ecstatic faith erupted from the masses. Zoltan's followers wept with joy, their belief vindicated, but more importantly, the faces of the dissenters transformed. Their skepticism shattered, replaced by a dawning, awe-struck reverence. Kale himself stood frozen, his analytical certainty crumbling before sensory evidence he could not explain. He had demanded proof of power, and in a language of physics he could not comprehend, she had provided it. Eva, her ears still ringing and her body trembling with adrenaline, met his gaze across the crowd. In that moment, she saw not an enemy but a defeated scholar. She had not just passed their test, she had weaponized their own science against them, using her human knowledge to perform a feat that, to their eyes, could only be divine. The immediate crisis was over, her position secured more firmly than ever, but the victory tasted like ashes. To save herself, she had deepened the very delusion she needed to escape, binding herself even tighter to a role that was becoming terrifyingly easy to play. The triumph of the Trial of Echoes was a hollow victory, a temporary dam holding back a tide of existential dread. For a few fleeting weeks, the city buzzed with a renewed, almost feverish devotion. The schism led by Kale seemed to dissolve, its followers returning to the fold with a humility born of witnessing the impossible. Yet beneath the surface of this restored harmony, a far more terrifying reality was unfolding. The astronomical instruments deep within the temple's sanctum, ancient crystal arrays that tracked the pulse of their solar system, began to tell a story that no amount of faith could ignore. The data was no longer a slow, generational decline discussed in hushed academic tones. It was a scream. The sun of Xylos wasn't just aging gracefully, its vital signs were crashing. High Priest Zoltan summoned Eva to the observatory, a chamber where the ceiling was a perfect lens focusing the light of the heavens. The usual golden glow of the room was tainted by a sickly orange hue. He didn't speak, merely gestured to the central crystal, which now projected a horrifying image. Their sun, once a brilliant sphere of white gold, was mottled with vast Inkai sunspots. Coronal loops, which should have been graceful arcs of plasma, were now chaotic, lashing tendrils that sputtered and collapsed. The readings scrawling alongside the image spoke of a precipitous drop in luminosity and a corresponding catastrophic dip in neutrino output. The star's very heartbeat was faltering. As if in sympathetic agony, the ground beneath their feet gave a low, grinding shudder. A planetary tremor, the first anyone could remember, rattled the crystal instruments on their stand. It was a physical manifestation of the panic that was beginning to grip the city outside, where the strange, dim light and the shaking ground were breaking the spell of Eva's last miracle. Zoltan turned to her, and for the first time, Eva saw not the unshakable faith of a high priest, but the raw, terrified plea of a man watching his world die. The ancient composure was gone, replaced by a frantic urgency. His voice, when it came, was stripped of its ceremonial cadence, reduced to a desperate, cracking whisper. "The time for waiting is over," he implored, his sun-gold eyes wide with fear. "The prophecies were clear, Starchild. When the sky grows dark and the world trembles, the sleeper must journey to the sun spire and perform the rite of ignition. You must go now, there is no other path." This was no longer a request, it was a final, gasping demand from a civilization on the brink. The sun spire, she had learned from the temple archives, was not a man-made structure, but a colossal, active volcano in the desolate northern ranges, a place where the planet's geothermal fury met the sky. The journey itself was legendary for its peril, traversing frozen wastes and unstable lands, a pilgrimage meant to test the mettle of a god. Eva's mind, ever the scientist, raced through the horrifying implications. A rite of ignition to restart a star. It was a concept so laughably beyond human capability it bordered on the grotesque. A star's life cycle is governed by forces of unimaginable scale, by the relentless crush of gravity and the fragile balance of nuclear fusion in its core. Humanity could barely forecast solar weather. The idea of engineering a stellar resurrection was the stuff of cosmic fantasy. Yet, looking at Zoltan's face, she saw that the abstract had become terrifyingly concrete. Their entire belief system, the very architecture of their hope, was built around this single, final act. To refuse was to watch their society collapse into chaos and despair before the final, cold death of their world. To agree was to lead them on a futile pilgrimage towards a miracle she knew she could not deliver. The lie had grown so immense it now had a geographic destination, a mountain of fire at the end of the world. With a slow, heavy nod, the weight of a dying sun settling upon her, she accepted her fate. She was no longer just playing a part. She was leading her congregation on a funeral march, and she was to be the chief mourner at the death of a star. The pilgrimage began not with a grand procession, but as a desperate, scaled-down exodus into the teeth of a dying world. Eva, Zoltan, and a hand-picked contingent of temple guardians, including a perpetually silent and heavily guarded Kale, left the city under a sky the color of a fading ember. The journey into the northern wastes was a brutal education in the reality of Xylos's decline. The vibrant, bioluminescent forests gave way to plains of brittle, gray grass that crackled underfoot. The very air grew thin and sharp with the scent of ozone and cold stone. This was not the paradise of her first arrival. This was a planet in its death throes, and every step forward felt like a march deeper into a tomb. The terrain itself seemed to actively resist them. They navigated fields of sharp, crystalline shards that could slice through their sturdy boots, forcing the party to move with painstaking slowness. They crossed deep chasms on bridges of petrified, crumbling vine that groaned ominously with every footstep. And then there was the fauna, creatures that had once been docile herbivores, driven to desperate aggression by the failing ecosystem, attacked their camp on the second night gaunt, six-limbed beasts with obsidian-sharp claws and a terrifying, shrieking cry. It was during this frantic, chaotic defense, as the Guardians formed a protective circle with their energy staffs, that Eva saw the limits of their reverence. While they protected her, they expected her to act. A creature lunged past the defensive line, heading straight for a young acolyte. Without a weapon, Eva's training took over. She grabbed a heavy, crystalline rock and with a precise, powerful throw, struck the beast squarely in the temple, stunning it long enough for a guardian to finish it. The acolyte saw a divine smiting, but from the edge of the firelight she felt Kale's gaze, analytical and cold, dissecting the sheer, mundane physics of her action. The true test came on the third day, as they traversed a narrow, crumbling ledge along the face of a colossal cliff. The path was a mere scratch in the rock, slick with a strange, freezing mist that rose from the abyss below. They moved in single file, pressed against the cold stone, the only sounds the howling wind and the dislodged pebbles skittering into the void. Eva was just behind Zoltan, with Kale and his guards following. Without warning, a section of the ledge directly under Kale's feet simply gave way. There was no scream, just a horrified gasp and the terrifying sound of shattering rock. Kale plummeted, his body arcing out into the emptiness. The Guardians froze, their ritual chants of protection dying in their throats, their faith offering no solution to the brutal laws of gravity. Eva didn't pray, she reacted. Years of zero-gravity training and extravehicular activity drills took command of her body. In one fluid motion, she unclipped the device from her hip, not a holy relic, but a standard-issue magnetic grapple gun, another piece of her survival kit the Xylans had treated with awe. She didn't aim with divine certainty, but with the practiced calculation of an astronaut. She fired. The grapple shot out, its claw finding purchase on a jagged outcrop just as Kale's falling body jerked to a violent, bone-jarring halt at the end of the 20-meter line. The sound of the cable straining against its anchor was a harsh, metallic screech that tore through the mystical silence of the mountains. With immense effort, her muscles burning and her boots scraping for purchase on the slick ledge, Eva, aided by the stunned guardians, hauled the trembling, dust-covered acolyte back to safety. Cale lay on the solid ground, gasping for air, his iridescent skin smeared with grime and his sun-gold eyes wide with the visceral shock of near death. He looked from the abyss to the utilitarian grapple gun still in Eva's hand, then up to her face, which was etched not with serene divinity, but with the stark, human strain of physical exertion and adrenaline. He pushed himself up, his voice a ragged, breathless whisper meant only for her. "A clever tool," he muttered, wiping blood from a cut on his brow. "A lucky save." Not a miracle, but the conviction in his voice was gone, replaced by a shaky confusion. The argument he had prepared, that she was a powerless fraud, could not erase the simple, undeniable fact that her clever tool and her swift, unhesitating action were the only things separating him from a bloody end on the rocks below. He had expected a distant, performing deity. He had been saved by a capable, decisive, and very physical being. As the party regrouped, the looks the other Xylons gave Eva were filled with a fresh, profound awe. But the look Cale now carried was far more complex and, for Eva, far more meaningful. A dawning, reluctant respect for the substance behind the symbol, a crack in the wall of his disbelief through which the first fragile thread of a potential alliance could begin to grow. After the brutal ascent, the sight that greeted them at the summit was both breathtaking and terrifying, a vista of cosmic hubris carved into the peak of a volcano. The air was thin and sharp, tasting of sulfur and ozone, and the sky above was a swirling, angry canvas of orange and black. Before them, dominating the entire caldera, was not a simple altar but an immense, sprawling machine. It was a masterpiece of lost engineering, a network of colossal crystal conduits and metallic alloys grown into the very rock, all covered in intricate, pulsating symbols that mapped out constellations and solar flares. To the Xylons, it was a holy place. To Eva's trained eyes, it was something else entirely. A planetary-scale geo-engineering array, a terraforming device of unimaginable power. Her mind raced, connecting the symbols to principles she understood. That conduit wasn't for channeling prayer, it was a plasma-focusing array. That crystal lattice wasn't an altar, it was a massive heat sink and energy capacitor. The entire apparatus was designed to tap into the volcano's immense geothermal energy, amplify it through a process she could only guess was some form of muon-catalyzed fusion, and fire a concentrated beam of energized particles directly into the star's chromosphere. The theory was staggering, a kind of stellar jump start using the planet's own heart to shock the sun back to life. It was audacious, brilliant, and far beyond anything human science had ever conceived. But as her gaze swept over the magnificent structure, her initial surge of hope curdled into cold dread. A central chamber, clearly meant to house a critical component, was a dark, empty socket. Wires and conduits that should have been glowing with power hung lifeless and severed, like torn ligaments around a gaping wound. The machine wasn't just dormant, it was crippled. High Priest Zoltan approached the silent core of the device, his hand trembling as he reached out but did not touch the void. The ancient certainty had drained from his face, replaced by a profound, weary sorrow that seemed as deep as the chasms they had crossed. "The heart of the sun," he whispered, the wind snatching at his words. It was the source, the celestial focus that gave the spire its voice, but it was lost. Lost in the Great War, an age of fire when our people turned this technology against one another. We shattered the heavens to conquer the ground, and in our folly, we broke the very key to our salvation. His explanation was a myth, but the truth beneath it was clear. His ancestors had fought a war using this very machine, and in the process, they had destroyed or lost the one component without which it was nothing more than a beautiful, silent monument to their own extinction. He turned to Eva, his sun-gold eyes dim with a final, devastating realization. Without the heart, the rite of ignition is impossible, the prophecy. It cannot be fulfilled. The words hung in the thin, toxic air, a death sentence for his world. In that shattering moment, the entire precarious narrative Eva had been living collapsed into a new, more terrible shape. This was no longer a test of her ability to perform magic. It was an engineering problem, and the most vital piece was missing. The Xylans saw a spiritual catastrophe, a god rendered mute. Eva saw a broken engine. Her mind, the mind of a commander and an engineer, began working furiously, discarding the framework of faith and analyzing the situation with cold, practical logic. A terraforming device of this scale wouldn't have a single, irreplaceable part. There would be redundancies, backup systems, unless the heart was something unique, a quantum-locked crystal or a stabilized exotic matter core that couldn't be replicated. Or a more chilling thought occurred to her. What if the Great War wasn't just about losing the component, but about the Xylans losing the knowledge of what it even was? What if they had been guarding a machine for millennia, praying to its empty shell without any memory of how it was actually built? As the rest of the party knelt in despair, their hopes extinguished as finally as their dying sun, Eva's eyes met Kale's across the scorched rock. He was not praying, he was watching her, his expression unreadable. He had seen her use technology. He had heard Zoltan confess that their salvation depended on a physical object lost to history. The line between divine providence and a scavenger hunt was blurring. The obstacle was no longer a matter of belief, but of logistics and archaeology. The question transformed from "Can you, a god, reignite our sun?" to the far more terrifying and concrete, "Can you, a stranded astronaut, find a missing piece of alien technology that vanished millennia ago, buried somewhere on an entire planet you don't know before the light goes out forever?" The pilgrimage had reached its end, but the true, desperate quest was only just beginning. The silence that fell after Zoltan's confession was heavier than the mountain itself, a suffocating blanket of despair that seemed to extinguish the very air. The Guardians knelt, their heads bowed, their faith finally broken against the unyielding reality of an empty socket. Eva stood frozen, her mind a frantic whirlwind of engineering diagrams and dead ends, the colossal machine looming over them all as a monument to a failed salvation. It was in this absolute stillness that a single, clear voice cut through, not with reverence but with a fierce, defiant resolve. No, all eyes turned to Kale. He was no longer the guarded, skeptical acolyte or the shaken survivor of the cliff face. He stood tall, his iridescent skin seeming to draw what little light remained from the sickly sky, his gaze fixed on the high priest. "We will not simply kneel here and wait for the dark," he declared, his voice ringing with an authority that silenced the wind itself for a moment. "You have asked us to place our faith in a symbol. But our people do not need a symbol to die for. They need a solution to live for." He turned his piercing, sun-gold eyes to Eva, and in them she saw none of the worship or the bitter suspicion of before. She saw the cool, calculating stare of a strategist who had just seen the game board reset. "The heart of the sun is not lost to time," he stated, the words dropping into the silence like stones. It was hidden by the very order that now prays for its return. A collective, sharp intake of breath came from the kneeling Guardians. Zoltan looked as if he had been physically struck, his ancient face contorting in a mixture of shock and dawning horror. Kale continued, his story unfolding like a heresy he had been waiting a lifetime to speak. He explained that during his deep studies of the forbidden texts, the uncensored histories from before the Great War, he had pieced together the truth. Fearing their own destructive power, a faction of the original builders had not destroyed the heart but had sequestered it. They hid it in the most secure, most treacherous place imaginable, the geode labyrinth, the ancient, automated citadel that had once served as the primary military stronghold during the conflict. It was a place sealed by decree, its location scrubbed from public record, guarded not by living soldiers, but by the still active, relentless war machines of a bygone age. It was a tomb for the very artifact that could grant life. He took a step toward Eva, his challenge now personal, direct, and utterly dangerous. The prophecies say the Starchild would command the spirits of metal and light, he said, a sharp, almost mocking edge to his voice. The labyrinth is filled with nothing, but so come, Starchild. You have performed tricks with sound and saved one life with a clever hook. Now let us see what you are truly made of. He gestured to the dying sky, to the broken machine, to the despair of their people. Prove you are the savior you claim to be. Help me retrieve what my own foolish ancestors stole from themselves. Or, he added, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper, prove you are the fraud I once believed you to be, and we will both perish in the attempt, a fitting end for a false god and her final, faithless follower. The gamble was breathtaking. This was no longer a test of faith, but a test of capability, and Kale was offering himself as both her guide and her judge. He was risking everything on the chance that the being he had accused of being a powerless imposter might actually possess the divine power to navigate a technological hell. For Eva, the choice was terrifyingly clear. This was the only path forward that didn't end in futile prayer. The geode labyrinth wasn't a shrine, it was a fortress. Its defenses weren't mystical, they were mechanical. This was a language she understood. It was a mission. Nodding once, her own expression shifting from desperate astronaut to determined commander, she simply said, "Show me the way." Leaving a stunned Zoltan and the Guardians behind with orders to secure the spire, the unlikely duo, the human who had to be a god and the alien who demanded proof, set off on a covert, desperate race into the heart of their world's most forbidden and dangerous history. The geode labyrinth was not a ruin, but a corpse, a colossal, crystalline carcass of a civilization that had cannibalized its own genius. Where the temple city of the Xylans was grown and organic, this place was carved and engineered, a brutalist fortress of obsidian and cold, dead light. Jagged spires clawed at the bruised sky, and the entrance was a yawning maw sealed by an energy field that flickered with a malevolent, unstable purple hue. Kale approached a hidden panel, his fingers moving with a nervous, practiced speed as he input a sequence from the forbidden texts. The defenses are autonomous, he warned, his voice tight. They do not distinguish between friend or foe, only intruder. With a final, decisive press, the energy field dissolved, and the silence that rushed out to meet them was somehow more threatening than any sound. Inside, the air was frigid and still, thick with the smell of ozone and ancient dust. The only illumination came from their own portable glow lamps, which cast long, dancing shadows down corridors that seemed to shift and reorient themselves when you weren't looking directly at them. It felt less like a building and more like the inside of a gargantuan, sleeping machine. They hadn't gone 50 paces when a low hum began to vibrate through the floor. From the ceiling, a grid of fine, crimson laser lines materialized, bisecting the corridor ahead. Eva's training kicked in instantly. She held up a hand, stopping Kale. Pressure sensitive, she whispered, her eyes tracing the pattern. It's a phased array. See how the beams are pulsing. Stepping through would trigger a cascading energy discharge. Kale watched, his skepticism momentarily replaced by a grudging fascination as she pointed to a nearly invisible vent along the wall. The power source for the grid is local. We can overload it, using a multi-tool from her kit, another holy artifact. She carefully pried the vent open, revealing a tangled nest of glowing conduits. With a focused intensity that was entirely human, she isolated the main feed and rerouted it back into the grid's own regulator. There was a sharp pop, a shower of harmless sparks, and the crimson lasers flickered and died, plunging the corridor back into a safe, mundane darkness. They pressed deeper, the labyrinth seeming to grow more hostile with every successful advance. The silence was soon broken by a new sound, a high-pitched insectoid whine that multiplied and grew louder with terrifying speed. From a side passage, a swarm of rogue maintenance drones descended upon them. They were small, agile things, each no larger than a human head, but their cutting beams could slice through stone and their numbers were overwhelming. Kale and Eva fought back to back, his energy staff deflecting beams while she used her grapple gun to snag drones out of the air, smashing them against the walls with brutal, efficient throws. In the midst of the chaos, one particularly aggressive drone broke through their defense, its beam sizzling past Eva's shoulder, searing a line across her environment suit. Without a second's hesitation, she dropped into a low crouch, snatched up a piece of shattered drone casing, and with a perfect underhand toss, jammed it into the drone's intake fan. The machine choked, shuddered, and exploded in a satisfying shower of metal and sparks. As the last drone clattered to the floor, the ringing silence returned. Kale stood panting, his chest heaving, his eyes wide as he looked at her, not at the symbol but at the woman, the sweat on her brow, the tactical grace of her movements, the sheer, unadorned competence. He let out a long, slow breath, the sound loud in the sudden quiet. "You do not fight like a god," he stated, his voice stripped of all its earlier mockery. "You fight like a warrior." That single, earned admission changed everything. The dynamic between them shifted from a tense alliance of necessity to something resembling mutual professional respect. They moved forward as a unit now, their movements coordinated, their silences communicative. The final chamber was protected by the most formidable defense of all, a massive, silent drone, a hulking sentinel that stood dormant before a sealed vault door, its single, unblinking red eye dark. As they approached, the eye ignited with a malevolent crimson light, and the machine unfolded itself with a series of hydraulic hisses, rising to its full, intimidating height. It was a test of pure combat, a frantic dance of evasion and attack. Kale distracted it with blasts from his staff, drawing its fire, while Eva used her agility and smaller size to get in close, targeting its joint servos with precise, disabling strikes from her multi-tool. With a final, coordinated effort, she jammed the tool into a critical leg actuator, just as Kale delivered a massive energy surge to its central processor. The Guardian drone shuddered, its red eye flickering, and then crashed to the floor inert. The vault door slid open with a deep, resonant groan, revealing not a room of treasure, but a small, stark chamber bathed in a soft, pulsating light. And there, floating serenely in the center of a containment field, was the heart of the sun. It was not a jewel or a weapon as Eva might have imagined, but a perfect, crystalline orb about the size of a human head. Within its flawless depths, a miniature star seemed to be captured, its light breathing in a slow, steady rhythm, casting shifting patterns of gold and white across their faces. It was beautiful, terrifying, and humbling all at once, a piece of a star, tamed and contained. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. They had braved the corpse of a dead age, defeated its mechanical guardians, and found the one thing that could possibly save a world. But as Eva reached out, her hand hovering just outside the containment field, a new, chilling thought occurred to her. They had the key. But did they have the knowledge to use it? And what if, in trying to save a star, they accidentally unleashed the very same power that had once been used to shatter the heavens? The journey back from the geode labyrinth should have been a triumphant march, the heart of the sun, a tangible promise of salvation cradled carefully between them. Instead, a cold dread began to crystallize in Eva's gut long before the sun's spire came into view. The first sign was the silence. The wind-swept paths leading to the summit, once patrolled by Zoltan's devout guardians, were utterly deserted. No sentries hailed their approach, no hopeful faces peered from the rock formations. The only sound was the ever-present, ominous groan of the dying planet beneath their feet and the sickly hiss of the wind through the dead, crystalline trees. As they rounded the final bend, the scene that greeted them was not one of desperate hope but of hostile preparation. The entrance to the Sun Spire's caldera was barricaded, a makeshift wall of sharpened crystal and volcanic rock manned not by the familiar temple guards, but by a contingent of Xylans whose skin markings were painted over with a new, aggressive symbol, a shattered star egg bleeding black. At the center of this defensive line stood a Xylan Eva had only seen from a distance during her time in the temple of Priest Valerius. He was younger than Zoltan, with a lean, predatory grace and eyes that burned with a fervor far colder than faith. He stepped forward, his voice cutting through the tense air like a shard of ice. "So the deceiver returns," he proclaimed, his words aimed not just at them, but at the armed followers flanking him. "And she brings the ultimate blasphemy with her." He pointed a long, accusing finger at the heart. "You would use the relics of our ancestors' folly to repeat their sin." To tear open the sky once more, his gaze then swept to Kale and his lips curled into a sneer. "And you, traitor, you would follow this creature of flesh and lies, digging up the weapons that damned us and call it salvation." Eva's mind raced, piecing together the coup that had clearly taken place in their absence. Valerius hadn't just been waiting, he had been planning. While they risked their lives in the labyrinth, he had been weaving a new, terrifying narrative for the masses. In the face of the impending apocalypse, his message was brutally simple. The Starchild was not a savior, but a herald of the final destruction, and the only path to purity was to reject her and embrace their fate with pious resignation. "High Priest Zoltan saw the truth of your corruption too late," Valerius spat, answering her unspoken question. "He languishes in chains, his weakness purged from our order. And you, the false idol, and her traitor acolyte, you will burn for your heresy upon the very altar you sought to defile." With a sharp gesture from Valerius, the barricade erupted into motion. Guardians who had once protected Eva now leveled their energy staffs at her, their faces set in masks of grim conviction. There was no time for debate, no room for the scientific explanations or careful diplomacy she had once relied upon. The only language left was that of action. As the first volley of searing energy bolts lanced toward them, Eva and Kale dove for cover behind a cluster of volcanic rock. The fight was a frantic, brutal ballet of survival. Kale's staff hummed and flashed, deflecting blasts and creating openings, while Eva used her grapple gun and the environment with a soldier's efficiency. She pulled supports from the barricade, creating avalanches of rock to disrupt their formations, and used the unpredictable geothermal vents that dotted the mountainside to her advantage, timing her movements to coincide with bursts of superheated steam that masked their advance. They fought not to kill, but to break through, every moment a conscious theft from the dwindling time their sun had left. The sky above was a terrifying spectacle, the stars' light now stuttering like a failing lamp, casting the world in erratic, strobe-like flashes of dull orange and deep shadow. Each flicker seemed to fuel Valerius's followers with a more desperate fury, their attacks growing more reckless. Eva and Kale moved as a single unit, their trust forged in the geode labyrinth, now the only thing holding the line against the tide of zealotry. They burst through the final defensive ring, leaving a path of stunned and scattered guards in their wake, and sprinted for the ramp that led up to the machine's central platform. But Valerius was waiting for them at the base of the ramp, Zoltan's ceremonial staff now in his hands, its tip crackling with amplified energy. "I will not allow you to complete this sacrilege." He screamed, his voice raw with fanatical rage. He lunged not at Eva but at Kale, the true architect of this defiance in his eyes. The clash of their staffs was a shriek of tortured energy, a duel of ideologies made violently physical. Eva saw her opening. As Kale parried a vicious blow, she didn't hesitate. She fired her grapple not at Valerius but at a precariously balanced, massive crystal formation above him. The claw bit deep, and with a mighty heave, she brought the entire structure down upon the priest in a thundering cascade of stone and light. The last thing they saw of Valerius was his look of stunned disbelief before he was buried beneath the rubble. Without a word, they turned and ran, their lungs burning in the thin air, their bodies pushed past exhaustion. They staggered onto the summit platform, the colossal, silent machine looming over them. The empty socket in the central core seemed to pulse with a desperate need, but as Kale moved to insert the heart, a final, gut-wrenching problem revealed itself. The socket was designed for a specific interface, a complex pattern of crystalline pins and receptors. The heart they had retrieved was smooth, flawless, with no visible means of connection. It was a key, but the lock had been broken or altered in the millennia since the war. The machine, for all its majestic power, could not recognize the very thing it was built to use. They had won the battle, fought their way to the summit against impossible odds, and now, at the final moment, they were held hostage by an ancient technological incompatibility, with the light of the world literally fading in and out above their heads. Staring at the impossible disconnect between the smooth heart and the complex socket, Eva's mind, trained to solve problems in the void, locked onto a new possibility. The socket itself was the problem. It wasn't just broken, it was wrong. While Kale frantically searched the platform for some kind of adapter or tool, Eva's eyes were drawn not to the central apparatus, but to the base of the machine, where the ancient, pulsating symbols were etched deep into the volcanic rock. She had seen them as religious iconography before, but now, with the heart's pure light washing over them, she saw them for what they truly were, a schematic. Dropping to her knees, her fingers tracing the grooves, she began to read the story they told. It wasn't a prayer, it was an operator's manual. The symbols mapped a flow of energy that wasn't just about amplification, but about translation, converting the raw geothermal power into a specific, coherent particle stream. And the language of these symbols, the precision of the angles and the mathematical consistency of the ratios, was not born from the organic, flowing artistry of Xylan culture. It was stark, efficient, and utterly alien to this world. It was the handwriting of a different creator entirely. A terrifying, thrilling realization dawned on her. The Xylans hadn't built the Sun Spire, they had found it. They were the inheritors of a technology so advanced it might as well have been magic, and over countless generations, they had woven a mythology around its empty shell, forgetting the practical genius of its original architects. The heart wasn't a key that fit a lock, it was a universal power source that needed the machine to be reconfigured to accept it. The socket wasn't a port, it was a placeholder. The true interface was the entire platform, and the symbols were the controls. "Kale, help me," she shouted over the groaning wind. "We need to redirect the primary energy conduits. These markings, they're not prophecies, they're instructions." Working together with a frantic, shared purpose, they began to shift massive crystalline levers that were disguised as decorative pillars, realigning the giant, root-like conduits that fed into the core. It was a desperate, physical act of engineering, their muscles straining against stone and crystal, the mountain shuddering in sympathy as they fundamentally altered the machine's purpose. By the time Valerius's stunned followers, shaken by the collapse of their leader and emboldened by the deteriorating sky, gathered at the edge of the platform, the work was done. The machine hummed with a new, deeper frequency, its internal light shifting from a weak orange to a vibrant, hungry blue. The smooth heart of the sun now rested not in a socket, but in a newly formed basin of focused energy at the center of the realigned conduits where it floated, pulsing in sync with the mountain's own heartbeat. Eva stood before the crowd, her body aching, her suit torn, but her voice clear and strong, cutting through the supernatural wind. She pointed not to the heavens, but to the machine at her back. "You call this a temple, you call this a rite, but you are wrong." Her voice carried across the caldera, amplified by the spire's own acoustics. "This is not a place of prayer. It is a power plant, a machine of almost impossible complexity, left here not by your gods, but by a people who came before you, a people of scientists, of builders." She saw the confusion and the dawning horror on their faces, the bedrock of their belief cracking under the weight of her words. Your ancestors were not prophets waiting for a sign. They were engineers who understood the stars. They did not write prayers, they wrote equations. They didn't lose a holy artifact in a war. They lost the knowledge of how to use the most important tool ever left on this world. This revelation was more devastating than any claim of her being a fraud. It stripped their entire history of its divine meaning, reducing millennia of faith to a game of telephone played with a dead civilization's user manual. But in that devastation, Eva offered a new, more powerful form of hope. Faith did not build this, intelligence built this, and your salvation will not come from begging the sky, but from understanding the work of your own hands, from reclaiming the legacy of curiosity and courage that truly belongs to you. She turned from the crowd, her eyes meeting Kale's, and gave a single, decisive nod. It was time to stop talking about science. It was time to use it. The moment of truth arrived not with a gentle hum, but with a violent, celestial scream. As Eva placed the heart of the sun into its energy basin, the sky above them convulsed. The star's final death throes began in earnest, unleashing a massive coronal mass ejection, a wave of superheated plasma that bloomed on the star's surface like a monstrous, silent flower of fire. The light on the planet's surface didn't just dim, it flickered manically, casting the terrified faces of the Xylan onlookers in a strobe like hellscape. The ground trembled with increased ferocity, and the air itself grew thick with static, making the hair on Eva's arms stand on end. The heart, now active, glowed with an almost painful brilliance, and the sun's spire began to draw power from the volcano with a deep, guttural roar that vibrated up through their bones. This wasn't a gentle awakening, it was a machine being forced back to life after 1,000,000 years of slumber, and it was furious. Instantly, Eva's world narrowed to the console of symbols before her. The schematic she had decoded was now a living, breathing entity, and it was in distress. Warning glyphs flared to life across the platform, their light a sickly, alarming red. The main energy conduit, the primary artery feeding from the planet's core, was overloading. The ancient system, strained by its sudden reactivation and the chaotic solar energy bombarding it, couldn't stabilize the power flow. Crystalline components began to glow a dangerous cherry red, and the hum of the machine pitched upward into a strained, high-frequency whine. This was a systems failure on a planetary scale, and Eva's years of training on complex, temperamental starship reactors took over completely. This was just another critical system on the verge of meltdown, and she was the only engineer on duty. Her voice cut through the chaos, sharp and clear, stripped of all pretense of divinity and filled with the unmistakable tone of command. Kale, the tertiary conduit is overloading. I need you to manually vent the pressure now. Use the crystalline shunt on your left, the one shaped like a tuning fork. She didn't ask, she ordered, and Kale, his own analytical mind recognizing the flawless logic in her instructions, moved without hesitation. His earlier doubts burned away in the furnace of this shared crisis. Meanwhile, the newly freed High Priest Zoltan, his body frail but his spirit ignited by Eva's revelation, was not idle. His deep, lifelong knowledge of the spire's ceremonial layout, the very knowledge built on myth, became unexpectedly practical. The secondary emitter array is destabilizing, Eva shouted, her eyes never leaving the flow of energy she was monitoring. Zoltan, the prayer chamber directly below us, it's a capacitor bank. I need you to get down there and physically cross-connect the large blue crystals. It will reroute the surge. What unfolded was a symphony of unlikely collaboration. Eva, the human astronaut, was the conductor, her mind processing data at a speed no Xylan could match. Kale, the skeptical scholar, became her chief engineer, his hands executing her commands with a precision born of newfound respect. And Zoltan, the broken high priest, became a humble technician, his faith now channeled into the tangible act of saving his world by connecting wires his ancestors had mistaken for holy relics. Redirect all auxiliary power to the primary emitter array. Now, Eva barked, her fingers flying across the control glyphs, making micro-adjustments to the particle stream's frequency. The machine shuddered violently, and for one heart-stopping second, the light from the heart seemed to falter. The crowd gasped, a unified sound of despair. But then, with a final, decisive input from Eva, the chaos coalesced into order. The shrieking whine of the machine dropped into a stable, powerful thrum, a deep bass note that resonated in their chests. The wild, red warning lights winked out, replaced by a steady, brilliant white luminescence that climbed the spire's central tower. At the very peak, the emitter array flared to life, gathering the raw, volcanic and stellar energy into a single, focused column of pure white energy. It was a blade of light so intense it seemed to cut the very fabric of the sky. With a sound that was less a noise and more a feeling of profound release, the beam lanced upward, a defiant answer to the star's dying flare, spearing directly into the heart of the raging solar storm. For a long, breathless moment, nothing happened. The beam held, a silent, desperate plea cast into the heavens. Then, on the view screens formed by the ancient crystal arrays, they saw it. The massive sunspot, the source of the destructive flare, began to shrink. The chaotic, lashing tendrils of plasma slowly, impossibly, began to recoil and stabilize. The star's violent convulsions were being soothed, its faltering heartbeat steadied by a jolt of energy delivered from its own planetary child. The machine was not reigniting the sun, it was healing it. And in that one impossible moment, the universe held its breath. On the crystal arrays, the dying star's frantic death rattle smoothed into a steady, rhythmic pulse. The terrifying sunspots shrank, the lashing tendrils of plasma receding like waves calming after a storm. The column of pure energy from the sun's spire had not been an attack, but a cosmic defibrillator, delivering a precisely calculated shock to the star's faltering heart. The sickly, flickering orange that had painted their world in shades of dread dissolved, washed away by a wave of brilliant, golden white light. It was a light that felt like life itself, warm and certain, bathing the mountain peak, the watching Xylans, and the entire planet in a luminous embrace they had not known for generations. A collective, shuddering sigh rose from the crowd, a sound of release from a fear so profound they had forgotten what it was like to live without it. Then the sigh became a cheer, not the chanted prayers of believers, but the raw, ecstatic cry of survivors. They wept, they embraced, they looked up at their reborn son with faces full of a joy so pure it was almost painful to witness. In the midst of this rising tide of celebration, High Priest Zoltan did not cheer. He stood apart, his frail form seeming even smaller against the majestic, humming machine. He turned from the glorious sky, his ancient, sun-gold eyes finding Eva's. There was no anger in his gaze, no bitterness. Instead, she saw a sorrow as deep and silent as space itself. He walked toward her, his steps slow and heavy on the vibrating platform, the cacophony of joy surrounding them like a distant ocean. When he spoke, his voice was a whisper that carried more weight than any proclamation. "You have saved us, Starchild," he began, his words laced with a profound and terrible gratitude. "You have given my people back their future, their light, their very lives. For this, our debt is eternal." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the cheering masses, over the machine that was not a temple, over the colleague he had imprisoned and the acolyte who had betrayed his doctrine. "But our faith is in ruins. You did not just heal our son. You dismantled the very foundation of our world. What are we?" he asked, his voice cracking with a devastating honesty. "Without our gods?" The question hung in the renewed air, a philosophical bomb dropped in the heart of a physical victory. Eva looked at him, this man who had built his entire existence around a beautiful, profound misunderstanding. She saw not a defeated priest, but a leader staring into an existential abyss. His entire framework for understanding the universe, the prophecies, the rituals, the divine purpose behind every natural phenomenon, had just been revealed as an intricate fiction built around a piece of forgotten machinery. The Starchild was not a celestial being but a mechanic. The rite of ignition was not a prayer but a system reboot. The temple was a control room. In saving them, she had rendered their entire belief system obsolete. What happens to a society when its spiritual compass is proven to be pointing at a mirage? Their joy was real, but it was the joy of a patient waking from a fevered dream, disoriented, grateful to be alive, but terrified of the unfamiliar, rational world they now had to navigate. Zoltan's sorrow was not for the loss of power, but for the loss of meaning. For millennia, the Xylans had understood their place in the cosmos. They were the children of a sacred narrative, their lives given purpose by a divine plan. Their struggles were tests of faith, their survival was a matter of cosmic grace. Now that narrative was shattered. They were simply inhabitants of a planet, saved not by divine intervention, but by the leftover technology of a vanished race and the quick thinking of a stranded alien. It was a colder, lonelier universe he was now beholding. Where once there was destiny, there was now random chance. Where there was a god, there was now a very capable, very tired woman from a planet called Earth. The cheering around them began to feel hollow. The victory tinged with the melancholy of a paradise lost, not the physical paradise of a living world, but the spiritual paradise of certainty. Eva had given them back their son, but in doing so, she had extinguished the guiding light of their souls, leaving them to find their way in a newly vast and inexplicable cosmos. The silence that followed Zoltan's heartbreaking question was the loudest sound Eva had ever heard. It was a silence filled with the crumbling of a universe of meaning, and she had no answer for him. How do you rebuild a soul after you have proven its God was a machine? She was still searching for the words, for any words, when a new, sharp crackle of energy tore through the quiet. It wasn't the deep hum of the sun's spire or the groan of the planet. This was a high-frequency, synthetic sound, and it was coming from her own wrist. The emergency communicator she had used to send her desperate signal, the one she had believed to be completely dead, sparked to life. A tiny, flickering light pulsed on its surface, and a voice, distorted by static but unmistakably human, cut through the Xylan air. "Pete, this is Earth reconnaissance vessel Endeavour on approach to Xylo's orbit. We are receiving a weak, automated beacon from the surface, registry matching the lost Earth ship Odyssey. Is there anyone receiving this transmission? Commander Rostova, if you can hear this, respond." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Every Xylan on the mountain peak froze, their celebration cut short, their heads tilting in unison toward the source of the strange, metallic voice. Their eyes, wide with a new, incomprehensible wonder, shifted from Eva's wrist to the sky, and then they saw them. At first, they were just new stars, a cluster of brilliant, moving points of light where none had been before. But these stars grew, descending through the atmosphere with a silent, impossible grace that dwarfed even the majesty of the sun spire's beam. They were ships, not the elegant, organic forms of Xylan myth, but angular, powerful vessels of polished metal and glowing engine nacelles, their hulls bristling with the pragmatic geometry of human engineering. From the lead ship, a voice boomed, not through the air, but directly from Eva's communicator, now clear and commanding. "Commander Eva Rostova, this is Fleet Captain Marcus Thorne of the Unified Earth Exploration Command. We read your signal by the stars. It's good to hear your voice after all this time. Prepare for immediate extraction. A shuttle is descending to your coordinates now." As if on cue, a smaller craft detached from the underbelly of the largest vessel, a sleek, armored shuttle that arrowed down through the atmosphere, its thrusters painting fiery lines across the newly golden sky. The reaction among the Xylans was not one of fear, but of a paradigm shift so profound it bordered on religious ecstasy, a new religion based on a terrifying, exhilarating reality. They did not kneel, they stood, transfixed, their faces upturned as the shuttle descended, its shadow passing over them. These were not the spirits of metal and light from their old prophecies, these were beings of metal and light. The Starchild was not alone. She had a tribe, a family, and they had come for her from the void. Whispers rippled through the crowd, new myths being born in real time. The Star Tribe returns, someone murmured. The children of the Sleeper are here. All eyes turned to Eva. In that single, suspended moment, every thread of her double life converged into one impossible choice. Before her stood the open ramp of the human shuttle, the smell of recycled air and ozone, a siren song calling her back to everything she was, to her people, to her home. It was the end of her ordeal, the rescue she had prayed for in her darkest moments in the temple. But behind her stood Zoltan, Kale, and an entire civilization teetering on the brink of an existential crisis. They had just lost their gods. If she left now, what would they make of these new ones who descended from the sky? Would they see allies or would they see conquerors? Would humanity, in its pragmatic efficiency, see a people to be studied and managed or partners to be respected? Captain Thorne's voice came again, softer now, tinged with a warmth that broke her heart. Eva, your mission is over. Your duty is to yourself now. Come home. Home. The word was a physical ache, but as she looked at Kale, who had fought beside her not as a follower but as a partner, and at Zoltan, whose entire world had just been unmade, she realized her duty had been radically redefined. Her mission was no longer the Odyssey's original mandate. It was the consequence of its failure. She was the only living soul in 2 galaxies who understood both sides of this impending first contact. She spoke the language of Earth and the language of Xylos. She understood quantum physics and the weight of prophetic verse. To step onto that shuttle would be to abandon this world to a future where 2 species might forever misunderstand one another, a future she had inadvertently set in motion. With a deep breath that felt like the first real one she had taken since awakening, Eva raised her communicator to her lips. Her voice was steady, clear, and carried the authority of a starship commander. Captain Thorne, this is Rostova. I am safe, and the situation planetside is stable but complex. I am not in immediate danger. Please hold your extraction. I am requesting that you and a diplomatic envoy join me on the surface. There is a civilization here, Captain. A beautiful, intelligent people who have just saved their own world with our help. And they deserve to meet their neighbors face to face, not as a subject of a military extraction, but as equals. She turned from the shuttle, facing the Xylans, her gaze sweeping over the crowd before settling on Zoltan and Kale. My people are here, but I am not leaving. Not until I have helped you build a bridge between our worlds. The choice was made. She was no longer the Starchild or the stranded astronaut. She was the first ambassador, and the most important mission of her life was just beginning. The air on the mountain peak, still humming with the residual energy of the sun's spire, was now charged with a different kind of power, the palpable tension of a first contact that was redefining itself by the second. The sleek, angular human shuttle sat like a promise on the volcanic rock, its ramp open, a bridge to a home Eva had dreamed of for so long. Standing between that ramp and the sea of Xylan faces, she felt the weight of 2 worlds pressing in on her. Captain Marcus Thorne and his small diplomatic team, clad in the crisp, functional uniforms of Earth, stood beside her. Their presence was a statement of stark, technological reality against the organic, crystalline beauty of Xylos. The Xylans themselves were a mixture of awe, confusion, and a dawning, hesitant hope. They had just witnessed their savior refuse rescue, and the meaning of that refusal was still echoing in their stunned silence. Eva stepped forward, turning her back on the shuttle, a deliberate and powerful gesture. She faced Zoltan, Kale, and the thousands of others, her voice amplified so it could reach the edges of the crowd and be picked up by the translators for the human diplomats. People of Xylos, she began, her tone not that of a deity but of a colleague, a peer. For a long time you have known me as the Sleeper, the Starchild. You built a faith around my arrival, and I, in my desperation to survive, allowed that faith to grow. She paused, letting the admission hang in the air, a necessary confession. But today you have seen the truth with your own eyes. You saw me not as a divine being performing a miracle, but as a commander managing a complex machine. You saw me work alongside Kale and Zoltan not through prayer, but through effort, through logic, through shared struggle. She gestured to the human envoys beside her. These are my people. We are explorers. We are builders. We come from a world called Earth, and we do not possess magic. We possess science. The light that banishes darkness is a simple circuit and a bulb. The voice that carries across distances is a modulated radio wave. The sleep from which I awoke was a controlled suspension of biological function. These are not miracles. They are tools, they are understandings of the universe that we have worked for centuries to uncover. She then turned her gaze to the magnificent humming sun spire. And this machine, which you called a temple, is the greatest tool of all. It was built by minds not unlike our own, by people who understood the laws of physics so deeply they could whisper to a star and calm its fury. Your ancestors were not waiting for a god, they were inheriting a legacy of genius they could no longer read. This was the pivotal moment, the point where the old world had to be gently laid to rest so a new one could be born. Eva raised her hands not in benediction but in invitation. The age of prophecy is over. The time for a new covenant begins now. Her voice swelled with a conviction that was both passionate and pragmatic. Let this be a covenant not of worship but of partnership. Let it be an agreement between two peoples standing as equals under the same sun. We, humanity, will open our libraries to you. We will teach you the science behind what you once called miracles. We will show you how to build, how to calculate, how to heal, and how to reach for the stars yourselves, not as an article of faith, but as an act of collective will. But this was not to be a one-sided transaction, a condescending gift from a technologically superior race. Eva understood the profound danger in that, the cultural imperialism that could easily poison this new beginning. She turned to include Zoltan and Kale directly in her gaze. And in return, you will share with us the wisdom of your world. You have lived in harmony with a biology we can only dream of. Your cities are grown, not built, leaving no scar upon the land. You understand the deep, resonant connections between life and the planet in ways our industrial societies have forgotten. You have maintained a society of profound community and spiritual depth, even if its original object was misplaced. That wisdom is priceless. We have much to learn from you about how to live, not just how to survive. The proposal was breathtaking in its scope and its humility. It was an offer to replace a vertical relationship of supplicant and deity with a horizontal one of student and teacher, where both species would occupy both roles. For the Xylons, it meant the terrifying but exhilarating freedom of self-determination. They would no longer be passive children of the cosmos, waiting for salvation from the sky. They would become its stewards, its engineers, its active participants. For the humans, it was a chance to avoid the classic pitfalls of first contact, to listen and learn, to approach another culture not as a problem to be solved or a resource to be managed, but as a repository of unique knowledge essential for their own evolution. Captain Thorne, a man whose career had been built on protocols and contingency plans, found himself moved by the raw, hopeful ambition of the moment. He stepped forward to stand beside Eva, his presence lending the official weight of Earth to her proclamation. Commander Rostova speaks for all of humanity, he affirmed, his voice firm and clear. We accept this covenant of partnership. We will establish an embassy, a place of shared learning. Our scientists will work with yours. Our historians will study your archives with reverence. And this world, Xylos, will henceforth be under the joint protection of our peoples, a sanctuary of knowledge and a beacon of what can be achieved when we choose understanding over fear. As the translators conveyed his words, a new sound rose from the crowd. It wasn't the unified chant of worship or the angry clamor of protest. It was a murmur of conversation, of questions, of realization. They were being offered not a new god, but a new identity. Zoltan, his face still etched with the sorrow of his lost faith, slowly straightened his posture. The emptiness in his eyes began to fill with a new light, the light of a daunting but genuine purpose. He was no longer the keeper of a sealed mystery. He was now a guide for his people into a universe of limitless discovery. Kale looked from Eva to the human scientists, a flicker of excitement in his analytical gaze. The puzzles were no longer theological, they were tangible, and he had an entire universe of new partners with whom to solve them. The dependency was broken not by denial, but by the offer of a greater, more empowering truth. The rescue of Eva Rostova was complete, but her mission had transformed into something far grander. She had become the architect of an alliance, and the first chapter in the shared history of Earth and Xylos was being written not in stone, but in a promise of mutual growth beneath their now brilliantly shining sun. In the days and weeks that followed that momentous first contact, a profound and necessary transformation began to reshape Xylan society, a process not of demolition but of careful, deliberate renovation. The old religious structures, so deeply embedded in their culture, did not simply vanish overnight. Instead, they were gently repurposed, their foundations of community and ritual finding new expression. The Grand Temple, once the heart of a faith built on a misunderstanding, became the first academy of reciprocal knowledge, a bustling hub where human engineers worked side by side with Xylan artisans, and where the ancient crystal archives were studied not for prophetic meaning, but for their forgotten scientific principles. It was within this dynamic, sometimes chaotic, environment of rebirth that Kale, the former skeptic, truly found his calling. He did not seize power, rather, a natural authority settled upon him, recognized by both the people and the newly forming governing council. His journey from devout acolyte to cynical dissident had prepared him uniquely for this moment. He understood the deep-seated need for meaning that the old religion had fulfilled, but he was now utterly convinced that a more honest, empowering purpose could be found in the tangible wonders of the universe itself. He sought out Eva one evening, finding her not in her new, comfortable ambassador's quarters, but where she so often was, on a balcony overlooking the Academy's central courtyard, watching Xylan and human children play a game that involved both crystalline harmonics and basic Newtonian physics. He stood beside her in a comfortable silence for a moment before speaking, his voice quiet but resonant with conviction. "You could have left," he stated, not as an accusation but as a simple, observable fact. "You had your people, your home, your rescue. You had endured more than any of us could comprehend. To step onto that shuttle was your rightful reward." He turned to face her, his sun-gold eyes, once so full of suspicion and then of grudging respect, now held a profound and unwavering gratitude. "But you stayed. You gave us truth, not lies. That is the greatest gift one being can ever give to another. You returned to us our own agency, our own capacity for greatness. We are no longer children waiting for a parent to fix our problems. We are partners in our own destiny." This was the core of Kale's new philosophy, the message he carried to every corner of Xylos. He became the chief architect of what he termed the Great Unlearning, a compassionate and systematic deconstruction of the dogmas that had constrained his people for generations. He did not mock the old beliefs or shame those who still felt their pull. Instead, he reframed them. He traveled to communities, standing in their public squares and explaining that the Starchild was not a lie, but a misinterpretation, a beautiful, hopeful story their ancestors had crafted to explain something they did not yet understand, a placeholder for a truth they were always meant to discover for themselves. The miracle was not that a god came from the stars, he would tell captivated audiences. The miracle is that the stars are knowable. The wonder is not in blind faith, but in the fact that our minds, our hands, our collective curiosity can learn to speak the language of the cosmos. He worked tirelessly with Zoltan, who had accepted a new role as the chief historian and cultural liaison, ensuring that the transition was not a violent rupture with the past, but a graceful evolution from it. His leadership was defined by this pragmatic empathy. He understood that a void left by a departed god could easily be filled by fear, nationalism, or new, even more dangerous superstitions. To prevent this, he focused on building tangible, positive replacements for the old religious framework. He championed the creation of secular festivals that celebrated scientific discovery, artistic innovation, and interspecies friendship. He established mentorship programs pairing the youngest, most brilliant Xylan minds with human experts, fostering a new generation that viewed the Earthlings not as deities but as colleagues and friends. He ensured that the partnership with humanity was one of true equality, fiercely protecting Xylan intellectual property and cultural artifacts from any potential exploitation, thereby building a foundation of mutual respect rather than dependency. Kale's ascendancy was not about his own power, but about his ability to empower his entire civilization. He became the bridge his people needed, one that allowed them to walk confidently away from the comforting shadows of dogma and into the brilliant, sometimes daunting, light of self-reliance, armed with the greatest tool of all, an unvarnished, magnificent truth about their own potential. The gentle hum of the new academy was a stark contrast to the profound silence of the old temple, a constant reminder of the seismic shift that had reshaped their world. In this new environment, High Priest Zoltan had become a quieter, more contemplative figure. He no longer led grand ceremonies, but could often be found in the archives, meticulously cross-referencing ancient Xylan glyphs with human astronomical data. It was in this new role as a scholar that he sought out Eva, finding her during a rare moment of solitude in a quiet garden alcove. The usual vibrant, confident authority he had carried for so long was gone, replaced by a palpable vulnerability that made him seem both older and more genuinely present than Eva had ever seen him. He did not bow or use any of the old formal titles. He simply stood before her, his hands holding a small, intricately carved data crystal that pulsed with a soft, internal light. "Ambassador," he began, his voice a low, resonant murmur, the word itself a conscious choice that acknowledged her new, true role. "I have walked these halls for many days, listening to the new stories being written. I hear our young ones speaking the language of quantum states and your engineers marveling at the symbiotic principles of our architecture. It is a beautiful noise." He paused, his sun-gold eyes, once so full of unshakable certainty, now held a deep, reflective sorrow. "But I have also been rereading our oldest histories, the ones I once believed held only divine prophecy. I see now that I was reading them with the wrong eyes. I was looking for a map to a predetermined destination, a script written by the cosmos. I failed to see that they were actually a journal, a record of a people trying to understand a universe far more complex and magnificent than our simple stories could contain." He extended the data crystal toward her. "This is a copy of our most complete historical record, from the first geological surveys of our world to the moments just before you awoke aboard your ship. It is not a holy text, it is an apology and an offering." His gaze was steady, filled with a hard-won clarity. "We sought a savior in the stars, but found a friend. Keep this so your people may know ours not as the followers of a misunderstood myth, but as we truly are. A people who have known great beauty and profound folly, who have loved our world deeply, and who, in our fear, built a beautiful cage of faith around our own potential." The gesture was immense. This wasn't just data, it was the soul of his civilization, offered not in worship but in trust. He was giving her the key to understanding every triumph and every mistake, every moment of wisdom and every epoch of fear that had defined the Xylan people. In doing so, he was voluntarily dismantling the last vestiges of his own authority, which had been based on the exclusive interpretation of this very knowledge. For Eva, the weight of the crystal in her hand was heavier than any star chart or mission log she had ever held. This was more than a historical archive. It was a bridge built from the very timbers of a fallen worldview. Zoltan was not just making peace with her, he was making peace with reality itself. He had led his people in a direction that ultimately rendered his lifelong vocation obsolete, and instead of clinging to the fading echoes of his old power, he had chosen to participate in building what came next. His redemption was not found in a dramatic reversal or a grand pronouncement, but in this quiet, humble act of giving away the very thing that had once defined his importance. He was planting a seed from the old forest into the soil of the new, ensuring that the wisdom of his people, stripped of its dogmatic Chinese letter, would continue to grow and inform the future. As she accepted the crystal, their eyes met, and in that silent exchange, a final, gentle door closed on the past. The sleeper and the high priest were gone, and in their place stood two colleagues, custodians of a shared history, looking together toward a future they would now build not on prophecy, but on a foundation of hard-earned truth and mutual respect. The husks of the old ways had been cleared away, making space for the vibrant, humming construction sites of a new era. The covenant between Earth and Xylos was no longer just a promise spoken on a mountain peak. It was becoming a physical reality, and its first great symbol was taking shape in high orbit. The wreck of the Starship Odyssey, once a tomb and a shrine, was now the focus of the most ambitious joint engineering project two species had ever attempted. Its scarred hull, pitted by centuries of micrometeorites and stained by atmospheric entry, became a canvas upon which the new partnership was literally welded. Human engineers in sleek, white exosuits worked alongside Xylan artisans whose iridescent skins glittered in the unfiltered sunlight, their movements a fascinating blend of human precision and Xylan fluidity. The goal was not merely to repair the old vessel, but to transform it. It would no longer be a relic of a single, failed mission, but a shared research vessel, a mobile embassy christened the Odyssey Ascendant. The work was a continuous, hands-on lesson in comparative technology. Human teams, masters of durasteel and plasma conduits, showed their Xylan counterparts how to reinforce the primary hull with carbon nanotube lattices, explaining the molecular bonds that made the material stronger than diamond. In return, the Xylans demonstrated their mastery of biointegration. They didn't just patch hull breaches, they cultivated a living, photosensitive resin that sealed the cracks and actually strengthened the surrounding metal, a self-healing technology that left the human engineers in a state of near-reverent awe. The ship's old, power-hungry life support system was replaced with a hybrid model, combining human air scrubbers with Xylan photosynthetic algae tanks that not only produced oxygen but also served as a fresh food source. Every corridor, every console, every system was a negotiation, a fusion, a testament to the idea that two paths of technological evolution, when woven together, could create something far greater than the sum of their parts. For Eva Rostova, walking the familiar yet alien corridors of her old ship was an experience layered with profound ghosts and exhilarating hope. The command deck, where she had once monitored the final, failing systems before entering Cryo-Sleep, was now utterly transformed. The stark, military gray panels were gone, replaced by interfaces that blended sleek human touchscreens with the Xylan's organic, crystalline data displays that responded to both touch and thought. It was here that she took on her most personal and symbolic task, teaching Kale to fly. He was a quick study, his analytical mind devouring the principles of orbital mechanics and thruster control with an intensity that mirrored his earlier theological deconstructions. He had gone from dissecting sacred texts to deciphering navigational algorithms, and the same fierce intellect was now applied to a universe of tangible cause and effect. During one of their first practical sessions, as they ran a simulation of a high-gravity slingshot maneuver around a gas giant, the ship's AI voiced a calm warning about inertial stress. Kale, his hands hovering over the controls, instinctively began one of the old rhythmic chants he'd used to focus his mind during temple meditations. Eva, watching the trajectory plotter stabilize, couldn't help but smile. She reached over, locked the navigation console, and gestured for him to strap his harness. "Trust the equations, Kale, not the echoes," she said, her voice warm with a shared understanding of how hard it was to shed old habits. As the simulation restarted and the ship's engines thrummed with a clean, powerful surge, she added with a playful nudge, "Besides, strap in. I promise you, a well-executed orbital burn is infinitely smoother than any temple chant." The remark made him blink, and then a genuine, unguarded laugh escaped him, a sound of liberation. In that moment, the last vestige of the hierarchical relationship between the worshipped and the worshipper evaporated, replaced by the easy camaraderie of two pilots preparing for a journey. The launch of the Odyssey Ascendant was not merely a mission commencement. It was a spectacle of unity witnessed by millions on the planet below and by the combined fleets in orbit. There were no grand pronouncements or religious proclamations. Instead, the ship lifted from its docking bay with a silent, elegant power that was a fusion of human and Xylan engineering, its hull shimmering with both metallic sheen and organic luminescence. Its mission was one of pure, shared curiosity, to explore the nearby Omicron star cluster, a dense region of young stars and protoplanetary disks that had long fascinated both species for different reasons. For humanity, it was a potential treasure trove of exoplanets and resources. For the Xylans, their ancient star charts had labeled it the cradle of whispering giants, a place of myth and celestial mystery. They were going to replace those whispers with data. On the bridge, the mixed crew worked as a single organism. A human science officer called out spectral analysis of a distant nebula, while a Xylan xenobotanist cross-referenced the findings with their own biological databases, looking for patterns invisible to purely technological sensors. When they encountered their first major discovery, a rogue planet, rich with geothermal vents and a subterranean ocean, it was a Xylan geologist who proposed a landing strategy that utilized the planet's magnetic anomalies for a softer approach, a concept the human pilots had never considered. The success of that first landing and the incredible trove of extremophile life they discovered in the planet's deep, lightless seas was a victory that belonged to no single species. It was a triumph of the new methodology they were creating together. The Odyssey Ascendant was more than a ship. It was a self-contained society, a working model of their alliance, proving with every light year it traveled that the future lay not in looking for saviors in the stars, but in joining hands to reach them together. The rhythm of cooperation aboard the Odyssey Ascendant had become a comforting constant, a symphony of two cultures learning to play in perfect harmony. But in the deep quiet of space, symphonies are often interrupted. It began with a subtle anomaly, a ghost in the machine that the ship's long-range sensors initially dismissed as a sensor echo from a distant pulsar. Yet the echo refused to fade. It grew, resolving from a nebulous blip into a solid, definitive signature, an object of immense mass moving at speeds that defied conventional physics, and it was on a direct intercept course for the Xylos system. The mood on the bridge shifted in an instant from one of focused exploration to one of high alert. The casual hum of conversation died away, replaced by the sharp, clipped language of a crew transitioning to a tactical posture. It was Kale, now serving as the ship's chief liaison and a fully qualified flight officer, who first isolated the incoming object's profile on the main viewer. The image that resolved sent a collective chill through the mixed crew. The vessel was a brutalist sculpture of sharp, asymmetrical angles and dark, non-reflective material that seemed to absorb the surrounding starlight. It bore no graceful curves like Xylan architecture, nor the functional, geometric lines of human design. This was a warship, pure and simple, its form speaking a silent language of jagged aggression and cold, predatory intent. Every sweep of its hull revealed no visible weapon ports, no engine nacelles, only a seamless, terrifying hull that looked less built and more forged in some dark, airless forge. Before anyone could voice a hypothesis, the ship's communication officer, a young human woman named Lieutenant Chen, spoke up, her voice tight with confusion. "Sir, it's broadcasting on all frequencies, standard and non-standard, but the signal structure is chaotic." Kale's hands flew across his crystalline interface, his brow furrowed in intense concentration as he worked to decode the transmission. The raw data stream was a torrent of seemingly random noise, but beneath the surface, his analytical mind detected a repeating, complex pattern, a mathematical language of stunning sophistication and immense implied power. He ran it through the Universal Translation Matrix, a joint human-Xylan project that was one of the new Alliance's proudest achievements. For a long, tense moment, the bridge was silent save for the hum of the ship's systems and the frantic tapping of Kale's fingers. Then the translation matrix locked on. A voice, synthesized and utterly devoid of emotion, filled the command deck. It was not loud, but its flat, absolute tone carried a weight that felt heavier than gravity. This system, designated K739 by the progenitor mandate, is a protected zone, the voice stated, each word a chip of ice. The indigenous biologicals are designated for study and containment. The extraneous vessel, Registry Odyssey Ascendant, is an unauthorized contaminant. You are instructed to power down all systems and prepare for boarding and assimilation. Compliance is mandatory. Resistance will be met with systemic cleansing. The message began to repeat, a cold, looping decree that stripped away all the progress, all the hope of the past months. It was not a request, it was a verdict. Kale turned from his console, his iridescent skin seeming to pale, his sun-gold eyes wide not with fear, but with a dawning, profound understanding of the threat. He looked first at the captain, then at Eva, who had moved to stand beside the command chair. "They are not hailing us," he said, his voice low and grim. "They are informing us this isn't a first contact scenario. It's an eviction notice. They claim this system, Xylos, this entire region of space, is theirs by some ancient right. And they see all of us, human and Xylan alike, as nothing more than specimens or infestations to be scrubbed clean." In that single, chilling moment, the nascent alliance between two species was confronted with a brutal external reality. Their philosophical differences, their cultural negotiations, their shared triumphs aboard this very ship, all of it was rendered trivial by the arrival of a third party that viewed them with the same detached, clinical disregard a scientist might have for bacteria in a petri dish. The common ground they had worked so hard to build was no longer just about partnership and discovery. It was now, suddenly and terrifyingly, their only possible ground for survival. Standing on the command deck of the Odyssey Ascendant, the alien warship filled the main viewer, a blade of dark metal poised to strike their fledgling alliance. The initial, chilling ultimatum hung in the air, a declaration of ownership and intent that left no room for negotiation. But Eva Rostova, who had once played the part of a goddess to survive, was not about to let her new home be designated for cleansing. A military response was unthinkable. Their vessel was a research ship, not a battleship, and a single misstep could doom two worlds. The only tool they had left was the very one they were building their future upon, diplomacy. "We need to talk to them," she stated, her voice cutting through the tense silence on the bridge. Not as invaders facing a threat, but as neighbors seeking an understanding. "We meet them face to face." The decision was a monumental risk. Captain Thorne argued for a defensive posture, for buying time to alert Earth's fleet and fortify Xylos. But Kale, his perspective forged in the crucible of challenging his own people's dogma, saw the profound logic in Eva's plan. "They have already judged us," he said, his gaze fixed on the menacing vessel. "They see us as contaminants. If we meet their aggression with aggression, we only confirm their bias. We must show them a reality their mandate does not account for. And so, a perilous invitation was sent, a request for a parley, a meeting of representatives in the neutral space between their ships. To the crew's stunned relief, the cold, synthesized voice from the alien ship offered a single, terse reply. A delegation of 3 may approach. Attempt no deception. The shuttle bay was a theater of profound symbolism as Eva, Kale, and Captain Thorne prepared to depart. They stood as a living representation of their covenant, the human commander, the Xylan leader, and the Earth fleet captain. They carried no visible weapons, only data pads containing shared scientific archives and linguistic databases. The short journey in the shuttle was a silent, gut-wrenching descent into the unknown. As their small craft was enveloped by the shadow of the alien ship and drawn into a cavernous, starkly lit hangar bay, the sheer scale of their adversary became terrifyingly clear. This was not a ship of exploration. It was a fortress designed for conquest, its very atmosphere thick with the scent of ozone and cold, recycled air. The chamber they were led to was as sterile and unwelcoming as a surgical theater. The walls were seamless gray metal, and the lighting was a harsh, clinical white that cast no shadows. Awaiting them were 3 of the aliens who called themselves the Cathar. They were taller than humans, their frames clad in armor of the same dark, non-reflective material as their ship, which seemed to drink the light from the room. Their faces were rigid, dominated by prominent brow ridges and deep-set eyes that glowed with a faint, crimson light, scanning the 3 delegates with a detached, analytical coldness. At their center stood their commander, a figure whose armor was etched with intricate, jagged patterns that denoted rank. He did not introduce himself. He was simply the voice of the mandate, and he expected them to kneel. You stand in a prescribed zone. The commander's voice emanated from a translator module on his chest, flat and devoid of any inflection that might suggest curiosity or empathy. The indigenous species, designation Xylan, are a protected study group. Your presence, humanity, is a contamination event. You will surrender your vessel and submit to processing. Eva took a single, deliberate step forward, her posture straight, her hands held openly at her sides. She met the commander's crimson gaze without flinching, her voice clear and measured, carrying the weight of her dual role as ambassador and survivor. We understand you have your laws, Commander, but we are not here as trespassers or contaminants. We are 2 species who have found common ground. We have formed an alliance, a partnership of equals. She gestured to Kale and Thorne. We did not come to this system to claim it, but to learn from it and from each other. The knowledge we have already shared has yielded wonders you cannot imagine. Our combined understanding of physics, biology, and engineering represents a potential that far exceeds the sum of its parts. She paused, letting the implication hang in the sterile air. We did not request this meeting to submit. We propose an alliance, a partnership between our peoples and yours. Our combined knowledge can benefit us all, opening pathways and possibilities that your mandate, in its isolation, may have never conceived. For a long moment, there was only the hum of the ship's systems. Then, a sound emerged from the Cathar commander, a low, guttural vibration that their translators passed not as laughter, but as pure, undiluted contempt. The crimson light in his eyes seemed to intensify, boring into Eva with the force of a physical blow. An alliance, the synthesized voice repeated, the word dripping with scorn. You speak of partnership with lesser beings, you who descended from the sky and allowed these primitives to clothe you in false divinity. You who peddle miracles that are nothing more than simple tricks of energy and matter. His armored hand swept dismissively, taking in both Eva and Kale. We are the Cathar. Our strength is our own. Our destiny is written in conquest, not in collaboration with those who would worship a stranded animal. We bow to no false gods, he snarled, the translator straining to convey the venom in his tone, or their pets. The insult was calculated, designed to shatter the very foundation of their unity by appealing to the darkest chapters of their shared history. He was trying to peel back the layers of their hard-won alliance, to reduce Eva back to the Starchild imposter and Kale back to the deluded worshipper. But the gambit failed. Kale did not react with anger or shame. Instead, he stepped forward to stand beside Eva, his own presence a calm counterpoint to the Cathar's bluster. "You see only what you expect to see," Kale stated, his voice steady. "You see a hierarchy of power. We see a tapestry of knowledge. You are so bound by your mandate of dominance that you are blind to the strength found in diversity. That is not our weakness, Commander. It is your profound and tragic limitation." The Cathar commander fell silent, his expression unreadable behind his helmet, but the tension in the room spiked from cold disdain to hot, volatile hostility. The door to diplomacy had not just been closed, it had been slammed shut and bolted from the other side. The stage was now set, not for an exchange of ideas, but for a trial by combat, where the very survival of two worlds would depend on outthinking a foe who believed that conversation itself was a sign of weakness. The Cathar commander's cold, contemptuous dismissal of their offer of alliance left a silence on the bridge of the Odyssey Ascendant that was heavier than any threat. They had reached for a handshake and found a closed fist, but as the alien warship began its ominous, slow advance, its dark hull drinking the light of the very star they had saved, Eva, Kale, and Captain Thorne did not descend into panic. Instead, a grim, shared resolve solidified between them. The time for words was over, the time for a demonstration had arrived. Retreating to their shuttle, they raced back to the Ascendant, their minds already sinking on a single, desperate strategy. They could not fight this warship head-on, but they didn't have to. They had to defend Xylos, and to do that, they would use the greatest tool they had ever built together, not as a weapon, but as a shield. Back on the command deck, the atmosphere transformed from a diplomatic chamber into a unified war room, though the battle they planned was one of pure defense. "They see a single planet and a single research vessel," Eva stated, her voice cutting through the tactical chatter. "They don't see the connection. Kale, we need to link the Ascendant sensor network directly to the Sun Spire's control matrix. We'll use the ship as a targeting relay." Captain Thorne, his military instincts taking over, began coordinating with his engineering team to route all non-essential power to the forward deflectors and communication array. Meanwhile, on the planet's surface, High Priest Zoltan, now acting as the planetary coordinator, was already mobilizing the global network of geothermal taps that fed the spire. The ancient machine, built to heal a star, was about to be asked to perform a new, unprecedented function. The plan was breathtaking in its ambition and its symbolism. They would use the combined knowledge of two species to create a planetary shield, not by building something new, but by repurposing the very energy that sustained their world. The Sun Spire's primary function was to channel geothermal energy into a coherent particle stream. The human engineers aboard the Ascendant proposed a radical modification. Instead of focusing that energy into a narrow beam aimed at the Sun, they could use the ship's navigational deflectors, calibrated with Xylan harmonic crystal technology, to scatter the particle stream. They would create a diffuse, energetic barrier around the entire planet, a shimmering, invisible dome of power generated from the planet's own heart. It was a perfect fusion of human large-scale engineering and Xylan precision energy manipulation, a defense that could only exist because of their alliance. Aboard the Cathar vessel, the response to this flurry of activity was likely one of arrogant dismissal. To them, it would have looked like frantic, last-minute preparations by insects scurrying before a boot. Their warship continued its advance, its weapons systems powering up with a low, ominous hum that registered on the Ascendant's sensors. They unleashed their first probing strike, a lance of crimson energy designed to cripple a ship's engines. It streaked toward the Odyssey Ascendant, a promise of annihilation, but just before impact, the space around the human Xylan ship seemed to breathe. A web of light shimmering with the golden-white hue of the stabilized sun and the deep blue of Xylan crystal energy flickered into existence. The Cathar beam struck this nascent energy field and did not explode. It was absorbed, its violent energy dissipated and harmonized into the glowing web, which pulsed once brilliantly and then stabilized. On the surface of Xylos, the sun spire flared with a light that could be seen across the day side of the planet. The ground trembled not from fear, but from the awesome power being channeled through it. In cities and villages, Xylans looked up at the sky, not in terror, but in awe, as a gentle, protective luminescence bloomed high in the atmosphere, a celestial umbrella woven from the fabric of their own world. The planetary shield was active. Back in orbit, the Cathar commander, for the first time, would have seen something his database could not immediately categorize. His vessel's primary weapon had been neutralized not by a counterattack, but by a defensive field of a type and scale his people had likely never encountered. A shield powered by a planet's core, managed by a starship, and harmonized by a technology that blended two disparate scientific paths into one seamless whole. It was in this moment of stunned, silent recalibration by their enemy that Eva opened a channel on all frequencies, her voice calm, clear, and imbued with the collective authority of two united peoples. Cathar vessel, you have seen our answer. We are not a people of war. We build, we learn, we protect. She paused, letting the image of their shimmering planetary defense serve as her witness. This system is our home. The alliance between humanity and the Xylan people is permanent. We will defend it with every resource at our disposal, and as you have just witnessed, our resources are considerable. This is your only warning. Break off your approach, leave this system now, or the next consequence you face will not be a shield, but a demonstration of what happens when the power to heal a star is turned toward a more direct application. The transmission ended not with a threat, but with a profound statement of fact. They had not escalated to violence. They had revealed a unity so strong it had become an impenetrable defense. The invaders were no longer facing a planet and a ship. They were facing a single, indivisible entity, a new power in the cosmos that had just proven it could not be broken by force alone. The Cathar commander's response to their defensive shield was not a retreat, but a silent, simmering rage that erupted into a storm of orbital fury. The initial contemptuous probe had failed, and now the true test of the alliance began. The dark warship, which they now knew was called the Judgment, unleashed its full arsenal. Swarms of drone fighters, like metallic shards from a shattered blade, poured from its launch bays, while its primary weapons began a systematic, brutal bombardment of the planetary shield. Each impact sent a visible ripple of strain across the shimmering energy dome, and deep within the sun spire on the surface, the crystal conduits groaned under the unprecedented stress. This was no longer a standoff, it was a siege, and the shield would not hold forever. Aboard the Odyssey Ascendant, Eva Rostova stood at the center of a storm of data and desperate ingenuity. The joint human-Xylan fleet, a motley assembly of Earth reconnaissance vessels and retrofitted Xylan atmospheric craft, was hopelessly outgunned. They could not win a direct confrontation. Eva's command style, forged in crisis, became a blend of human tactical doctrine and emergent Xylan intuition. She didn't just see ships and weapons, she saw a single, fluid organism. Don't form a battle line, she commanded over the fleet-wide channel, her voice calm amidst the chaos. Weave, the Judgment target's concentrated force. Will be a net, not a spear. She directed the more agile human frigates to perform feinting attacks, drawing the Cathar's heavy cannons, while the Xylan ships, with their superior understanding of local gravitational eddies, used the planet's orbital debris field as cover, launching hit-and-run strikes against the Judgment sensor arrays. It was a dance of distraction and harassment, a battle fought not with brute strength, but with relentless, coordinated motion designed to confuse and disorient a foe that valued overwhelming force above all else. On the surface, Kale's role was equally critical. He was not a soldier but a conductor of planetary resistance. From the newly fortified command center deep within the Academy, he coordinated the global ground forces. His genius lay in mobilization, not militarization. He directed teams of Xylan geologists to trigger controlled seismic events, creating artificial turbulence in the upper atmosphere to further scramble the invaders' targeting systems. He organized civilian crews to man auxiliary power stations, feeding every spare joule of energy into the straining planetary shield. When a Cathar boarding pod breached the shield and crashed near a major geothermal tap, it was Kale who dispatched not a military unit, but a team of Xylan bioengineers and their human counterparts. They didn't engage the armored Cathar soldiers directly. Instead, they used their knowledge of the local ecosystem, releasing a swarm of docile, silicon-based mites that infiltrated the enemy's power armor and short-circuited their systems from within. It was a perfect example of the Alliance's unique strength turning the environment itself into a weapon. The turning point of the battle came with a sacrifice that would be etched into the memory of both species. The Cathar, frustrated by the elusive fleet and the resilient shield, altered their strategy. They identified a vulnerability, a large, slow-moving Xylan arc ship, the Luminous Dream, which was evacuating civilians from a coastal city. The Judgment focused its main battery, a weapon capable of vaporizing a small moon, and fired a concentrated blast meant to annihilate the defenseless vessel and break the spirit of the defenders. On the bridge of the Odyssey Ascendant, the trajectory alarm screamed. Eva saw the Luminous Dream on the viewer, its organic hull glowing softly, utterly exposed. There was no time to calculate, no time for a complex maneuver. There was only one object in the path of that killing beam large enough and fast enough to interpose itself. Her decision was instantaneous, a commander's reflex honed by a journey that had begun with a cryopod and led to this single, defining moment. She didn't give a grand speech. She simply slammed her hand on the comms, her voice cutting through to engineering. All power to forward thrusters now, then to the helm. Set a collision course with that energy beam. Full emergency burn. The Odyssey Ascendant, the ship that had been her tomb, her shrine, her embassy, and her home, leaped forward. It was not an act of attack but of intercession. The magnificent hybrid vessel, a symbol of their hard-won unity, positioned itself directly between the Luminous Dream and the lance of pure destruction. The Cathar beam struck the Ascendant's forward shields, which buckled instantly. The beam tore into the primary hull, vaporizing durasteel and crystalline spars alike in a silent, horrific flash. The ship shuddered, its spine broken, its systems dying, but for a critical second it held, absorbing the cataclysmic energy meant for thousands of civilians. The Luminous Dream, bathed in the dying light of its savior, slipped away to safety. Silence fell across the battle. The sacrifice was so absolute, so visceral, that it seemed to freeze time itself. The shattered hulk of the Odyssey Ascendant drifted, a funeral pyre in the void, and then a new sound emerged, not from the human or Xylan comms, but from the Judgment. It was the voice of the Cathar commander, but the flat, synthesized tone was gone, replaced by something alien to it, a grudging, baffled respect. You destroy your own to preserve the weak, the voice stated, the logic of such an action clearly incomprehensible within the rigid framework of the progenitor mandate. This is not a viable survival calculus. Your cohesion is illogical. The message terminated. Then, without another word, the massive Judgment began to turn. Its weapons powered down and its engines flared to life. It was not a retreat from force, but a withdrawal from a paradigm it could not process. They had not been defeated by a superior military. They had been confounded by a bond they could not quantify. The invaders, who understood only dominance and submission, had witnessed an act of pure, selfless unity, and in the face of that illogical strength, they had no counter. As the Cathar warship vanished into the void, it left behind a silent testament to the power of the Covenant, a broken ship, a saved people, and an alliance that had been forged in fire and proven unbreakable. In the quiet stillness that followed the Cathar retreat, the true cost of their victory became heartbreakingly clear. The battlefield was not a field at all, but the silent, cold expanse of space, littered with the ghostly debris of shattered ships and the lingering echoes of sacrifice. The most poignant wreck was that of the Odyssey Ascendant, its once proud, hybrid hull now a twisted sculpture of metal and crystal, a permanent memorial orbiting the world it had given its life to protect. On the surface of Xylos, in a newly consecrated grove within the Academy Gardens, the two species gathered not for a celebration but for a remembrance. Human officers in crisp black uniforms stood shoulder to shoulder with Xylans whose iridescent skin seemed to absorb the summer light of the evening. They were there to honor every life lost, from the engineers on the Ascendant to the civilian volunteers who had powered the planetary shield until their last breath. It was here, surrounded by the living, breathing legacy of their alliance, that High Priest Zoltan stepped forward to speak. The ancient composure he had once worn like a ceremonial robe was gone, replaced by a raw, honest humanity that resonated more deeply than any sermon. He did not look at the crowd as a leader addressing his followers, but as a fellow survivor, his voice soft yet carrying across the hushed grove. "We once built temples to a Starchild," he began, his sun-gold eyes finding Eva's in the crowd. "We crafted prophecies and whispered prayers, seeking salvation from the stars. We placed our hope in a divine story." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the faces of humans and Xylans alike. "But today, we do not stand here because a god answered our prayers. We stand here because a woman, a commander, a friend, stood with us. She did not bring us magic. She brought us her courage. She did not give us miracles. She gave us the truth." He then turned, gesturing to the memorial stone at the center of the grove, etched with the names of the fallen from both worlds. "Let this stone be our new scripture. Let our new covenant be written not in ancient verse, but in the living principles we have proven with our own blood and breath. Courage in the face of annihilation, truth in the place of comfortable lies, and unity that proves stronger than any force of division the universe can muster." As Zoltan's words settled over the assembly, a new light emerged in the sky, gentle and promising at first, then multiplying into a brilliant constellation of hope. From the velvet black of space, a new fleet descended, not the jagged threat of the Cathar, but the sleek, purposeful forms of human vessels. These were not warships, but deep space arcs, colony transporters, and massive science vessels, their hulls emblazoned with the new, joint insignia of the Earth-Xylos alliance. They moved with a quiet, majestic grace, taking up positions in orbit alongside the solemn wreck of the Ascendant, not to replace it, but to honor its sacrifice by continuing its mission. They were the tangible promise of the future, a fleet dedicated to exploration and mutual growth, a direct result of the desperate plea for help Eva had sent from the temple what felt like a lifetime ago. Eva Rostova stood between Kale and Zoltan, watching the armada of her people settle into the heavens above her adopted home. She felt the weight of Zoltan's new scripture settle upon her, not as a burden but as a profound responsibility. She was no longer the Starchild, the imposter, or the stranded astronaut. The young acolyte who had once looked upon her with suspicion now stood as her trusted partner, a leader of his people. The high priest who had once knelt before her now stood as her colleague, a guide for a world rediscovering itself. Her smile was not one of triumph, but of quiet, enduring fulfillment. She had come to this world by accident, a ghost from a dead ship, but in her struggle to survive, she had forged something permanent. Her legacy was no longer a single story of rescue or a misunderstood myth. It was the living, breathing alliance itself, the bridge she had built between worlds, a structure strong enough to withstand the fury of invaders and founded on the unshakable pillars of courage, truth, and unity. The Sleeper had not just awakened, she had helped an entire civilization awaken to its own true potential, and in doing so had opened a new chapter for all of humanity, one written in the shared light of a healed sun.